Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami deva deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatar Varishtaya Chate Namaha Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatam Bhuvi Grinandiye Bhurida Jana. So today, this morning, excuse me, we will continue our reading of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna where we left off last time, and that is on June the 15th, 1883. In this book, it's near the top of page 249. And this was the day of Dasahara, a Hindu holiday. And so people were able to come, even though it was a weekday, a Friday. And so among the people who were gathered there was Rakhal's father, that is the later Swami Brahmananda, his father, and Rakhal's father-in-law, because Rakhal had been married already. And so those two were present among others. Of course, who recorded the conversations. So I'll just start where we are because it's not necessarily tied to what went before. It's not that there's context needed. He says, Sri Ramakrishna says, it will not do merely to repeat, I am he, I am he. There are certain signs of a jnani. Narendra has big protruding eyes, pointing to a devotee. He also has good eyes and forehead. So in this short paragraph, first Sri Ramakrishna says that it won't do just to say, I am he, soham, soham. That, of course, is a traditional practice and a very good practice in the path of knowledge, to identify oneself with the divine, with the Brahman, with the self, with Shiva. So I am he, soham, soham, soham. That's a traditional and very good practice, but Sri Ramakrishna says that by itself won't do. One has to have the temperament for that. One has to have the temperament and one has to be qualified for it. Here, qualification means not having passed a particular spiritual test or having attained to a particular spiritual state, but one has to have the temperament for it. One of the things you find in Sri Ramakrishna is that the people he was teaching were largely, as are people in general society, were largely devotional by nature. But because of modern education, which had come to India at that time, and because of the intellectual development of the common people, many people were attracted to a more philosophical and rational approach in religion. And so Sri Ramakrishna was often encouraging people to turn to devotion, knowing that that was their temperament. And so here he says it won't do merely to repeat, I am he, I am he. There are certain signs of a jnani. That is, Sri Ramakrishna was able to look at a person in two ways and tell all that he needed to know about their temperament, about their past, their present, and their future. What exactly their path was, what would help them, what would harm them. And so he points to Narendra he says about Narendra, Narendra I don't think was present, he says about Narendra that he has protruding eyes, and then he points to someone who is there present, though M doesn't identify him, and says he also has good eyes and a good forehead. So that, that was one way in which Sri Ramakrishna could assess the spiritual temperament and ability of a person by looking at the physical characteristics. As we know, he would often take a person's arm in his hands and weigh the arm, as it were, and by that he could tell something about the spiritual nature of the person. He would look at the eyes, look at the forehead, look at the formation of the limbs, etc. And so by reading the physical signs, he could tell a great deal about the person. But he had a second way, which was in which he knew even more about a person. And that was, he used to say that when I see someone, it's like looking through a glass case, the body being the glass case. That is, if inside a glass case you keep various knickknacks or objet d'art, whatever it is that you collect, you put them inside a glass case, and so you can see right through the glass to see what's inside. So he said that looking at a person, the person would be like a glass case, showing everything that was inside. So again, one way was to look at physical formations, and another way, a deeper way, was, and he used both of these to confirm his convictions about a person, was to look at the inner content of a person's mind and karma. He could know a person's past, he could know their present, and he could know the future path of their progress and where they would end up. And so in that way, he could assess a person's temperament. And so he led some on the path of knowledge, many more on the path of devotion. So he continues, all men are by no means on the same level. It is said that there are 4 classes of men, the bound, the struggling, the liberated, and the ever free. It is also not a fact that all men have to practice spiritual discipline. There are the ever free and those who achieve perfection through spiritual discipline. Some realize God after much spiritual austerity, and some are perfect from their very birth. Prahlad is an example of the ever free. So here he says that, and he continues this same idea through the rest of the discussion here. He says that people are not on the same level, that people are at different levels of progress. People have different capacities, different powers, powers of understanding, powers of action, powers to do spiritual practice. The different abilities to profit from the spiritual practice and so forth, to benefit from the spiritual practice. And so all men, as he says, are by no means on the same level. People are at different levels of progress and on different and of different temperaments, and so following different paths towards God. And so he says that there are 4 basic classes. And of course, within each of these classes, there are many different levels and different types. But the 4 basic classes are the bound, that is, those who are bound by Maya and not even struggling to get out. They don't even know that they're bound. They just lead an ordinary life and think that that's all there is to do. So the bound, the struggling, those like those of us who are gathered for this class, who are struggling, who are trying to progress spiritually. That's the category we fall into, the struggling. Those who are practicing sadhana, those, however little or however much we're doing, if we have the idea that I want to lead a spiritual life, then we have already awakened to the class of the struggling. And then the third class are the liberated, those like us who through their struggling and the grace of God have attained to perfection, the free. They've attained to mukti, moksha. They're free from the bondage of karma. They don't have to come back for rebirth. They are enlightened, liberated, however you want to call it. And the fourth are the ever free. So the difference between the liberated and the ever free, both are free. But the ever free are born from a state of freedom. That is, they don't come into this world with past karma that has to be worked out and past ignorance that has to be eradicated. They come from a state of freedom, often with an avatara. That is, they often come as companions to the incarnation of God. And as the incarnation is born out of freedom, out of the will to bring salvation to other beings, so the ever free come to accompany him. And so these are the four classes: the bound, the struggling like us, the liberated like us when we attain to liberation, and then the ever free, those who never entered into Maya. They were born from a state of freedom. And in their youth, their childhood and youth, they may have some forgetfulness, but there's just a thin veil of forgetfulness drawn over their mind until they can mature. And then quickly, without spiritual practice even, they attain to their former state of perfection. He says, it is also not a fact that all men have to practice spiritual discipline. There are the ever free and those who achieve perfection through spiritual discipline. So again, the liberated are those who achieve enlightenment through spiritual discipline, through going through a course of sadhana. But then there are the ever free who just, in their youth itself, their spirituality begins to manifest. They may do a little practice, but that practice is not the cause of their liberation. It's because of their pure samskaras. What else are they going to do but to do spiritual practice? So he says that Prahlad is an example of the ever free. Most of you know the story of Prahlad, which is in the Vishnu Purana, and much later it comes in the Srimad Bhagavatam. I say much later because the Vishnu Purana is much, much older than the Srimad Bhagavatam. And so the story of Prahlad, he was the son of a demon, an asura, Hiranyakashipu. And his father was a demon who hated the gods and who had tried to defeat the gods in battle and to take over the world. And so he had the son, Prahlad, who from his childhood, from his earliest utterances, he would praise Vishnu. He would repeat Vishnu's name, he would pray to Vishnu, etc. And the father was irate because he recognized himself as Lord of the universe, not Vishnu. And so he tried everything to punish his child, to get him to stop repeating Vishnu's name, but nothing worked. He even tried in various ways to kill his son. In order to silence him, as the final method to silence him, and that also didn't work. Finally, when he tried an extreme method, then Narasimha, that is Vishnu in the form of half man, half lion, a lion's head and lion's paws, but a human body, manifested and devoured his father Hiranyakashipu. And so Prahlad is presented as the ideal bhakta, the ideal devotee. And Sri Ramakrishna would speak of him that way. Swami Vivekananda speaks of him that way in his Bhakti Yoga. And generally, he is held up to be the ideal devotee. A much higher devotee than Dhruva. Dhruva's story also is told in these ancient texts, but Dhruva had the desire to regain his kingdom, who as a boy he had lost. And so his worship of God was motivated, it was sincere, but it had the tinge of desire, of wanting to regain his place. But Prahlad had no desire except for to love and to worship Vishnu and to surrender Vishnu. So he is the example. He's an example. There are others also of the ever free. There's, of course, Shukadeva and many others in the tradition. And in modern times, we can see, of course, the several of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna that he said were Nitya Mukta, ever free. And then there was Ramana Maharshi, outside of our tradition, but very much in the Vedanta tradition and very much an admirer of Sri Ramakrishna, who at the age of 16, without any prior spiritual practice, he suddenly attained full enlightenment and lived the rest of his long life in a state of full enlightenment. So these are the ever free. So Sri Ramakrishna continues, eternally perfect sages like Prahlada also practice meditation and prayer, but they have realized the fruit, God vision, even before their spiritual practice. They are like gourds and pumpkins, which grow fruit first and then flowers. So here he says again that Prahlad and such people may practice spiritual disciplines, they may practice prayer and so forth, but they have realized God first. They have had first the vision of God, and then they practice spiritual practice. Again, because what else are they going to do? If you've realized God, then you want to spend all of your time, or you spend all of your time in that consciousness. And so to us, it looks like spiritual practice. For them, it's just what they do, remaining in that awareness. And whether it's through repeating the name of God or doing worship or whatever, it's coming out of the fullness of their heart and not from longing to attain to something. And so he gives the example that he would often give of gourds and pumpkins. Those of you who are gardeners will know that first a little gourd or pumpkin begins to form and the flower comes out of it. If you have a flower just on a stem with no baby gourd or pumpkin, then you know that that is not going to produce fruit. But the flower that comes out of a forming fruit, that you know is going to be a gourd or a pumpkin, because the fruit is already forming before the flower comes. And so he says that the ever-free are like the gourd or pumpkin. Most flowers, you first get the flower before there's any sign of a fruit, and then the fruit develops afterwards. But he says the ever-free are like the pumpkin or the gourd or the squash, who first develop the fruit and then the flower comes. So then he looks at Rakhal's father. And Rakhal's father was a wealthy man and was not completely happy with Rakhal spending so much time with Sri Ramakrishna. But Sri Ramakrishna had succeeded in charming Rakhal's father so that he became more agreeable to Rakhal staying there. His father was not a deeply spiritual person, was not a spiritual person, but he was subject to Sri Ramakrishna's ordinary charm, the charm and the charming words that he used in praising Rakhal's father. And so being charmed, he became satisfied with his son spending more time there. So looking at Rakhal's father, he says, even though an eternally perfect soul is born in a low family, still he retains his innate perfection. He cannot do anything else. A pea germinating in a heap of cow dung still grows into a pea plant. So now this is interesting, because Rakhal, of course, was one of the Nitya Mukta, one of the ever-free. And so here Sri Ramakrishna is looking at the father of this ever-free disciple of his and saying that even if an eternally free soul can be born even in a low family, that he still retains his innate perfection if he is born in a low family. And so whether Rakhal's father understood what Sri Ramakrishna was saying or not, that we don't know. But we can be sure of one of two things, depending on whether he was aware of what Sri Ramakrishna was saying or not. If he was not aware of what Sri Ramakrishna is saying, then of course he didn't take insult at what Sri Ramakrishna said, because he just heard his words and didn't apply it to himself. if he did understand what Sri Ramakrishna was saying, that is, comparing an ever-free soul like Rakal to a pea being planted in a dung heap and still growing into a pea. That would be terribly insulting words for a man like Rakal's father. But with a person like Sri Ramakrishna, and we don't know if Rakal's father understood the connection, but if Rakal's father did understand the connection, Sri Ramakrishna had the power to say those words right to the heart of him so that he would understand them without taking personal offense. That the last thing Sri Ramakrishna wanted was for Rakal's father to take offense and to take Rakal away and insist that he never come back. So Sri Ramakrishna had the power to say something to a person, and I've seen this in a few rare others, very rare people, great spiritual people, who could say something devastating to a person, and yet the person would take it because something about the way the person said it, the atmosphere that they created, the power of their words, the energy within their words, convinced the hearer that this was for their good. And so they didn't take it personally, they didn't take personal offense. That's very rare. And I've also seen many people who either are appointed as teachers or who pose as teachers trying to do the same thing with very bad results. That should never be done by anyone unless they have the power to do it. And those who have the power to do it know that they have the power to do it. The words just come out of them spontaneously, and it works. So a person teaching another should never take the position of somebody who's, well, I'm going to tell that person, I'm going to say this in such a way that they're going to learn their lesson. No. Teaching should never be given as a way of showing somebody something or punishing somebody or getting back at somebody or putting somebody down. And so someone like Sri Ramakrishna had the power that if Rakal's father understood it, for it to go in and for him to accept it as just a fact and not as something that is putting him down. Because again, these are extremely insulting words. And so it's if his father understood what Sri Ramakrishna was saying, it's to his credit that he was, is to his credit and also to the credit of Sri Ramakrishna, who had that power to say it. So Sri Ramakrishna continues, God has given to some greater power than to others. In one man, you see it as the light of a lamp, in another as the light of a torch. One word of Vidyasagar's revealed to me the utmost limits of his intelligence. I should say, let me stop here because I'll lose it when I get to the end of this long paragraph. That he said that some have the light of a lamp, another the light of a torch. But he would say that his Noren, Vivekananda, he was like the blazing sun, in the light of which all other lights were paled into insignificance. Such was the light of his spiritual intelligence and his spirituality. So anyway, God has given to some greater power than to others. In one man, you see it as the light of a lamp, in another as the light of a torch. One word of Vidyasagar's revealed to me the utmost limit of his intelligence. When I told him of the different manifestations of God's power in different beings, he said to me, Sir, has God then given greater power to some than to others? At once I said, yes, certainly he has. If there are not different degrees of manifestation of his power, then why should your name be known far and wide? You see, we have come to you after hearing of your knowledge and compassion. You haven't grown two horns, have you? With all his, and then Sri Ramakrishna comes back to telling his present audience, with all his fame and erudition, Vidyasagar said such a childish thing as has God given greater power to some than to others. The truth is that when the fisherman draws his net, he first catches big fish like trout and carp. Then he stirs up the mud with his feet, and small fish come out, minnows, mudfish, and so on. So unless a man knows God, minnows and the like gradually come out from within him. What can one achieve through mere scholarship? So here, first he begins by saying that there are different manifestations of power in different people. In modern times, that's not a popular idea. The idea that all are created equal is very prevalent, and Vedanta agrees that all are of equal value. All are manifestations of the same self. And as Sri Krishna says in the Gita, sargo yesham samye stitam manaha. Here itself, those have attained, they have, here itself, they have conquered this relative existence, who see sameness everywhere. Who see the same reality within the cow, within the dog, within the eater of dogs, within the learned Brahmin, who see the same self within all. And so that is what Swami Vivekananda taught, that same-sidedness. But that doesn't mean that at this level, there are not differences among people. There are great differences. Some people have great power, some have little power. Some have great eloquence, some have a hard time stringing two words together to make sense. Some people are great artists, other people have no artistic talent. That they're great. Some people have a great influence over others. Some have a influence over a few, and some don't seem to influence anyone. Some have great attractive power. Others have a little bit of attractive power. Some don't seem to attract anyone's notice. And so there's certainly a difference of manifestation here. So same-sidedness means seeing the same God within everyone and treating everyone the same, because treating everyone with the same respect, because all are manifestations of the same self. But again, it doesn't mean that at the level of manifestation there aren't differences, and that's what Sri Ramakrishna is saying here, and he often used to say. He mentions Vidyasagar, who was very famous at that time, and he's still very famous in Bengal, even a century after much more than a century after he passed away. His name is still very well known in Bengal, because he's a man who was brought up in terrible poverty, grinding poverty. But he became a great scholar, a great pundit, and a man of great wealth and great charity. He gathered wealth and then gave it freely to one and all. So he became famous for his scholarship and for his great compassion and the charity based on that compassion. And so Sri Ramakrishna says that he understood the limit of Vidyasagar's intelligence, the limit of his understanding, when Sri Ramakrishna said that God has given different amounts of power to different people. And Vidyasagar said, what? Does God give different amounts of power to different people? Surprised, because again, even at that time, he had been educated in Western ideas of equality. And so he assumed that everyone is the same. Circumstances differ because of the circumstances of a person's life. But the idea that was popular at that time, that all come into the world with equal capacity, but some make use of it and some don't. And some have environments which give them the opportunity to rise and some don't. But he was shocked to hear that people have different amounts of power to begin with. So Sri Ramakrishna tells him that if they're not differences of manifestation of God's power, why have we come to see you? Is it because you've grown two horns that we've come to look at? No, it's because of your great knowledge and your great compassion, which stands far above ordinary people. That's why your name is known far and wide. That's why we have come to see you. And so he says that Vidyasagar said such a childish thing, he says, that has God given more power to some than to others? So then he gives an interesting analogy, the meaning of which is not immediately clear. He says that the fisherman casts his net into the water to catch fish, and first catches the big fish, the easy fish, which are those that are easy to catch in the net. But then the fisherman begins to work the mud at the bottom with his feet, and that stirs up the small fish and the minnows and the mudfish who are sleeping in the mud and so forth, and he can catch them also. So what does that have to do with what he's saying here? Well, what he's using it to illustrate is, and it's a very wonderful point, is that what he did in talking with Vidyasagar was to stir up the smaller ideas within Vidyasagar, so that he comes out with a statement like, "Has God given more power to some than to others?" That is, just going to see Vidyasagar, and he's great in knowledge and he's great in his compassion. Those are the big fish. Those are the things that everyone sees. But Sri Ramakrishna knew how to knead the mud of a person. That is, to bring out their more basic ideas, their more basic understanding that other people wouldn't even be aware of. And so he brought out that silly, childish idea from Vidyasagar. Swami Prabhavananda used to say, and this is a very helpful thing. It's the same basic point, just a different different way of expressing it, but very helpful when we have to deal with the people, especially people who pose as spiritual teachers. Swami Prabhavananda would say that a person who has studied spirituality and learned the ideas very well, out of 10 things that they say, 9 of them will be perfect. And you'll think, oh, this is such a sage. This person has such deep understanding of spirituality. This is a real spiritual person. But there's always a 10th thing that they will say which gives it all away and lets you know that, no, these are only ideas in their head. They've learned the language, they've learned the concepts, they can repeat the concepts, but there's always one thing where you can catch them that reveals that they don't know what they're talking. They don't really know from experience. They're talking just from a conceptual level. And so it's the same idea that Sri Ramakrishna is speaking from, except that Swami Prabhavananda's example is tied specifically to spiritual teachers, whereas this means people in general. And there are many people, and I don't ever publicly give names and things, because that's not fair to those who are devoted to a particular teacher or something. But there are many who they read the texts of someone like Ramana Maharshi or Nisargadatta Maharaj, and learn all of the basic ideas, because the basic ideas as ideas of Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta Maharaj are very easy to grasp for someone who has the intellectual equipment, who is good at dealing with abstract ideas and things. You can quickly learn because their answers to questions are all coming from their unitary standpoint. And so you learn that, and then you can talk in the same way. And so it's very useful when one is in the marketplace of spiritual ideas to know this, because such people will always, at some point, if you look carefully enough, they'll always give away the fact that they really don't know what they're talking about. They're talking from the top of their head. Again, it's very, it's very easy in the realm of Advaita Vedanta. That's very easy in the realm of Zen Buddhism as well. Both wonderful traditions, and both with illumined souls. But it's easy in both because they can be reduced to ultimate simplicity. Advaita Vedanta and Zen Buddhism both can be reduced to an ultimate simplicity. And if you understand that, and you understand conceptually where the person is speaking from, then a person, again, who's intelligent, good at dealing with abstract ideas, they can easily learn the language. And you ask them questions, and they give answers all couched in that language. And they just have to maintain consistency. But sooner or later, something gives them away. So now we've come to the end of June 15th, and we will begin June 17th, 1883. So again, this is just 2 days later. Sri Ramakrishna was resting in his room in the temple garden at Dakshineshwar. It was afternoon. Adhar and M arrived and saluted the master. A tantric devotee also came in. Rakal, Hazra, and Ramlal were staying with Sri Ramakrishna. Master to the devotees, why shouldn't one be able to attain spirituality living the life? Why shouldn't one be able to attain spirituality living the life of a householder? But it is extremely difficult. Sages like Janaka entered the world after attaining knowledge. But still, the world is a place of terror. Even a detached householder has to be careful. Once Janaka bent down his head at the sight of a Bhairavi. He shrank from seeing a woman. The Bhairavi said to him, Janaka, I see you have not yet attained knowledge. You still differentiate between man and woman. And so here he starts by raising the question, why shouldn't one be able to attain to spirituality as a householder? Now, 2 days ago, in the days whose narration we just ended a few minutes ago, earlier than what we read today, there was the question of one of the devotees, how is it possible, or is it possible for a householder devotee to attain to God? And so now 2 days separate that, but Sri Ramakrishna comes back to that theme, whether it's because of the memory of that former discussion or whether it was just a theme on his mind at the time. But he says that it is possible by asking the question, why shouldn't it be possible? Yes, it is possible. But he says it is extremely difficult. Here one should add that that doesn't mean that it's easy for a monk to attain to God. No, just by becoming a monk, one doesn't attain to God. But he's recognizing that for a householder, it is very difficult because there are so many pulls on a householder. There are responsibilities which have to be fulfilled, and in the process of fulfilling them, we're in contact with all kinds of people who have other ideas and who try to pull us in other directions and so forth. So yes, it is extremely difficult. And then he refers to King Janaka, the great example in the Hindu scriptures of a householder who lived a life of enlightenment, who attained to enlightenment and lived a life of enlightenment, even as a king ruling a kingdom, in the family, in the palace, ruling a kingdom, and yet a person of enlightenment. So he says that even a detached householder has to be careful. Once Janaka, the king, bent down his head when he saw a Bhairavi, that is, a woman ascetic of the Shaiva school, a devotee of Shiva, a Bhairavi, coming, her being a woman, he bent his head down so that he wouldn't look at her, that being considered not good for a spiritual aspirant, to avoid the sexual attraction. And so he bent his head down. So the Bhairavi, noticing that, says, so I see that your knowledge is not full, because you still see the distinction between man and woman. And so that doesn't mean that Janaka had not yet attained to enlightenment by this time, but it means that his enlightenment was not perfected. As I've said on another occasion recently, I forget what the topic was, but a person who attains to perfection, it is said, who attains to liberation, if they die then and there, then they're liberated. But if they continue living in the body, there are still old habits within the mind that need to be burnt out by repeated immersion into enlightenment. And so that's why we get stories like of Shankaracharya being touched by the outcast when he's returning when Shankaracharya is returning from his bath, and Shankaracharya says, "What, you've touched me? Now I have to go and take my bath again." And the untouchable turns out to be God himself, who has appeared in that form to destroy his ignorance, and says, how could that which has no form, that which has no body, that which is beyond the mind, time, and space, how could it be touched by anyone? And then Shankaracharya realizes that he still was suffering from this social ignorance. And the same thing with Swami Vivekananda when he was in Khetri during his wandering days, when the word was sent to his quarters that a woman was going to sing in the court, and they wanted the Swami to come hear her lovely voice. And the Swami, realizing that she was a dancing girl, which at that time meant probably a prostitute, he said, no, as a sadhu, as a monk, I won't come. That won't be proper for me to go and to hear such a person singing in the court, entertaining people. And then the woman, hearing that the Swami would not come because she was a dancing girl, a dancing girl, she began to sing a song about the God being the same-sided one, and how the knife of the butcher and the ceremonial sword in the temple, both are made of iron, but when they touch the philosopher's stone, both are turned into gold. And so, O Lord, you who are the same-sided one, look not upon my evil qualities, that through your touch I become the same as the saint, because through your grace. And Swamiji, hearing the song, is so overcome with remorse for the ignorance of having looked down on this woman as unfit for him to be in her presence. So then he comes out shedding copious tears to listen to the rest of her singing. So even a person who has attained to illumination, there's the example of Totapuri in Sri Ramakrishna's life, who had attained to Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He was already liberated. He had already had the highest knowledge, but that highest knowledge had not yet completely dominated his human point of view. When he was out of Samadhi and seeing the world, he knew that this was all unreal, and yet he still reacted to it as though it were real. And so it was Sri Ramakrishna who took him beyond that remaining vestige of ignorance. And so that's why they say there's the Brahmavit, the one who is the knower of Brahman, like Totapuri. The Brahmavit Vara, one who is the greater knower of Brahman, like Totapuri, after he had learned at the feet of Sri Ramakrishna, learned from his own disciple. And Brahmavit Varishta, the greatest of the knowers of Brahman, like Sri Ramakrishna or Swami Vivekananda, those who eventually have no vestige of ignorance left. Of course, Swami Vivekananda came back to that only at the end of his life. During his life, Sri Ramakrishna kept a veil over his full knowledge so that he could work. So, he continues, if you move about in a room filled with soot, you will soil your body, however slightly, no matter how clever you may be. I have seen householder devotees filled with spiritual emotion while performing their daily worship, wearing their silk clothes. They maintain that attitude even until they take their refreshments after the worship. But afterwards, they become their old selves again. They display their rajasic and tamasic natures. And so here, no matter how careful you are, if you move about in a room filled with soot, you eventually get some on your clothing. And so he's saying that in the context of the discussion about why shouldn't householders be able to attain to God, that they can, but that it's very difficult because living in the world, it's very, very difficult to avoid being touched by the world. And then he continues, Sattva begets bhakti. Even bhakti has three aspects, sattva, rajas, and tamas. The sattva of bhakti is pure sattva. When a devotee acquires it, he doesn't direct his mind to anything but God. He pays only as much attention to his body as is absolutely necessary for its protection. So as we've seen in our study of the Bhagavad Gita on Tuesdays evenings, the three gunas, they govern everything. They color everything. And so even bhakti has its sattvic aspect, its rajasic aspect, and its tamasic aspect. And sometimes Sri Ramakrishna advised people to practice tamasic bhakti. He said, just as a paramour grabs her lover by the throat and says, you have to pay attention to me. I've given up everything, society, honor, everything out of love for you. Now you can't abandon me. So the devotee should, as it were, grab God by the throat and say, I've given up everything for you. You can't abandon me now. You must show yourself to me. So that, he said, was tamasic bhakti. So here he says sattva. In general, sattva begets bhakti. The more sattvic we become, then we find that bhakti begins to grow within us as a concomitant, as a natural result of bhakti itself. I mean, of sattva itself. So when the mind becomes sattvic, when the mind begins to become tranquil, transparent, luminous, then bhakti begins to grow within that mind naturally. So uh, let me read just one more paragraph. He says, um, or two short paragraphs together. But a Paramahamsa is beyond the three gunas. Though they exist in him, yet they are practically non-existent. Like a child, he is not under the control of any of the gunas. That is why the Paramahamsas allow small children to come near them in order to assume their nature. Paramahamsas may not lay things up, but this rule does not apply to householders. They must provide for their families. And here he said, there was one thing in the previous paragraph that I read before that I forgot. He says, he pays only as much attention, that is, a devotee who acquires bhakti, pays only as much attention to his body as is absolutely necessary for its protection. So yes, that much attention is given to the body, but not the worship of the body, which if that was present in Sri Ramakrishna's time, and if it was historically present in human society, what would Sri Ramakrishna think of today, where so much attention is given to the body, so much money is spent on skin, that there's so much attention given to it. So, but then he says in the next two short paragraphs, he says that the Paramahamsa is beyond the three gunas. He's three guna atita, beyond the three gunas, not influenced by sattva, rajas, and tamas. That comes to a person who has attained to sattva. When a person has attained to pure sattva, then one can step beyond the three gunas. One can't step there from tamas or rajas, but it's when one has attained to that state of equilibrium and purity and clarity, transparency, then one can step into the infinite and realize that, and the gunas are left behind, including sattva itself. So he says that like a child, the Paramahamsa is not under the control of any of the gunas, just as a child is not under the control of such. The child plays freely, without any worry, without any preoccupation. And so he says that that is why Paramahamsas allow small children to come near them in order to assume their nature. Paramahamsas oftentimes would play with children, would spend time with children to assume that childlike nature where there's no care in the world, no attachment to anything. So Paramahamsas may not lay things up, but this rule does not apply to householders. They must provide for their families. So as Sri Ramakrishna, he couldn't keep anything for himself. He couldn't store anything. But in the family, you have to provide for the family. And so there, the rule is different. And even in an ashram, as our swamis would say, one has to, because one is responsible for an institution, one has to provide for the institution and see to its need. Now, one day, what we seek to do, all of us, whether sannyasi or householder, is to come to a state of enlightenment where that also will fall away. Where we live in a state of perfection where even running an institution is impossible. Swami Ashokananda used to say that one day I should reach the state, or may I reach the state one day, where the very idea of coming down here, he was saying that because he lived up on the lived upstairs, come down here to give a lecture that will be impossible. Even the very idea will not come to me, because I'm living in that realm where making such decisions, it just doesn't happen, because who is going to decide what? And so until that, then we have to live in a way that is sustainable, that we can sustain our life, but where we develop more and more inner detachment. So, yes, we have to pay attention to our duties, we have to fulfill our duties, we have to fulfill our responsibilities, but gradually develop that spirit of detachment from the things we do. Do it just because it's there to be done, so that eventually we can attain to a point where the mind is free enough to enter into God. And then we come back and we're, as Sri Ramakrishna said, like the woman who has just given birth to a baby, then nothing is expected of her. She's free just to spend her time with her baby. And so, like that, we will just be in a state of enlightenment with no responsibility. All responsibilities will fall off from us. So I'll stop here, and we'll continue next time. Uh, Last week, I was not able to give the class. I regret that. Apologize for that. Because I had something, I had to be on the other side of town for something, for a practical matter, not for a deep spiritual matter, but a practical matter, that morning. And so, and it had to be done that morning. So I was not able to give the class last week, but that was an exceptional circumstance. So we will continue with our normal schedule of classes and lectures. On Sunday, I'll give a talk on Swami Vivekananda because we celebrated his birth in puja, by ritual worship last Sunday. And this Sunday, I will speak on him, who he was and what his legacy is. Then next week, we will continue the Gita class, Tuesdays at 7:30 p.m., and this Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class, Thursday mornings at 11 a.m. So there are no special announcements right now. So I will see if there are any questions. There are no questions. Okay, no questions today. So I'll just give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha.